My name is Hannah, and this is my year of less stuff. Hey y'all, welcome to my review of the newly released Urban Decay Naked Ultraviolet palette. Before we get into the video, I need to acknowledge that this is a really intense eyebrow situation. We just got back from our sojourn to Northern California. I'm back in my apartment in LA, and I just got carried away this morning. I don't know, I left most of my makeup here, and when I started doing my eyebrows this morning, I was like, what if I just penciled them in really dark? But I know that most of you guys don't care. You're just here to hear my scathing review of the Naked Ultraviolet palette, and that is what I'm going to deliver. Thrillingly, for once in all of our lives, Sadie has condescended to be in the background of my video, but she's like curled up in the exact spot that causes me to obscure her when I'm centered in the frame, so I don't know how much of her we'll see, but she is here. If this is your first time to my channel, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. I'm a passionate lover of beautiful things, but I have a troubled history with shopping. So on my channel, I celebrate the joy and the value that beauty can add to our lives, but without normalizing overspending, because I am not about that life. So if that kind of content sounds good to you, I hope you'll subscribe. Let's go ahead and get into the meat of the video. The way I've been conducting my single product reviews lately is to make a list of all of the questions that I myself have about the product before I see it, before I try it, and then in the review I go through my list of questions and I answer all of them. I'm going to depart a little bit from that structure for this review simply because this palette has disappointed me so dramatically that I don't feel like it's worth it to really get into the nitty-gritty of every single answer to every single question, because right out of the gate I can tell you I would absolutely not buy this, I'm not going to keep it. So the two questions that I'm going to answer are, how do the shadows perform? Like, what's the physical quality of them? What's the reality of the way that the shadows are formulated? And then the other question is, what is the color story like in practice? So the palette was waiting for me in the mail when we got back from our trip to Northern California, and it was sent to me for review by Urban Decay. Needless to say, I'm very grateful to occasionally receive things in PR from Urban Decay. I wish that the news were better, but the fact that it was sent to me for free does not in any way sway my opinion about the formula and the color story. The packaging is lovely. It is very sturdy. It's very attractive. I do like that. It's probably the thing that I like about it the most, but I have struggled so much every time I've tried to put it onto my eyes, and I've now made 4 eye looks with this. I find the pigmentation very weak. My goal today was to apply as purple an eye look as possible, as ultraviolet a look as possible, because I knew I was going to be reviewing the palette. So I wanted to give the best representation of the heart and soul of this palette that I could possibly give. So I went right for this super ultraviolet kind of blue-purple iridescent color, and I could barely get any buildup on my lids with it. I had to go over and over and over again. I had to really dig into the shadow and get like flakes of powder onto my finger and press those flakes of powder onto my lids and smear them around. I often do go in pretty heavily with my finger when I'm dipping into beautiful shimmery shadows to coat my lid, but the shadows that I'm going into, the shadows that I have, are usually creamy. So I'm usually able to get a nice thick smear of creamy shadow onto my finger, and I'm usually able to then transfer that onto my lids. It didn't work out that way with this eyeshadow. I worked and worked and worked to build it, and when I finally got enough color built up on my lid so that I felt like I had something to work with, it was very powdery. I then went in with a pale lavender matte shadow to blend it out, and it barely showed up even on my very, very light skin. I do think that this shadow, that the light colored mattes in this palette are meant to be very light, very naked. It is a naked palette after all. So even though it's professing to be the ultraviolet version of the naked palettes, it's still a naked palette. And I definitely did get a naked palette style wash of pale lavender when I went in with this matte. It was just really hard to work with it. It's very dusty, it wants to be patchy, it didn't do a very good job of blending with and blending out that other shadow. It's just unsatisfying to work with, both in terms of the pigment and in terms of the way that the pigment performs and the formula performs. I was aiming for a pretty simple monochromatic look, so after that I decided to just go in with the absolute darkest color in this palette and deepen up my outer corner. So I took Digital, which is this dark, kind of smoky and maybe slightly plummy gray, and I started going in the outer corner to build up some dimension on my hooded eyes and also to smoke out the look. And it was incredibly difficult, as it has been every single time I've worked with this palette, incredibly difficult to get the shadows to build on one another. And you'll see me trying and trying and trying to build some smokiness on the outer corner of my eyes, which is something that I do almost every time I do my eyeshadow. And I've done it with all different kinds of shadows across all price points, and I rarely struggle with this part of building a smoky eye look. But with this shadow, with Digital, or even the other dark shadow in the palette, Purple Dust, which I've also tried to work with in this capacity, with either of those deepening shades on top of any of the other shades or blending together with any of the other shades in the palette, they won't stick, they get patchy. When I start blending them out, they blend away to absolutely nothing. It's really hard to get dimension added into the corners. It's hard to get any kind of depth. And it also really easily ends up looking like a bruise because these two deepening colors are both purpley blue in their undertone. You have to be incredibly careful, and you have to really pack it on and then try not to blend too much away to make the deepening of the outer corner look intentional rather than looking like some kind of damage to the tissue of your skin. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself with that because this bruise issue is more an issue of the color story, but at the same time, if the formula were more robust, if these deep colors would actually hold their own when layered on top of the other shadows and when blended out with them, then it wouldn't be so much of a problem, because the way to use bruised colors, but to keep it from looking like your skin is actually bruised, is structure. The more structure, the more dimension there is, the more contrast there is between light and dark, the less it looks like a bruise, the less it looks like some sort of wound, and the more it looks intentional. So you can use the colors of a bruise to create a beautiful eye look. It just has to be really structured and really clear, and then there has to be really, really dark darks and really, really light lights. And I couldn't get structure with this formula. I couldn't get dark darks and light lights with this formula. And so the fact that the color story is somewhat indicative of a bruise means that it often ended up, when I tried to make an eye look, looking like a bruise. So I did absolutely everything that I could to darken up the outer corner and add dimension. I eventually had to stop because just nothing was changing. I would add that darkening shadow and it would just look the same. I really had gotten to the limit of what I could do in terms of making dimension, and the look still looked so lackluster that I decided to try to go in with the shade in this palette that I was the most excited to try out, which is the shade VR. So I got it on my finger, as you'll see in the footage, and I went in over top of the eye look and just nothing. Absolutely nothing. This was the shade about which I had the highest hopes after I looked at the swatches, and it's the shade that let me down the most, if I can even say that it let me down more than like the mattes and also the dark colors. Like, they all maybe let me down equally. But because I had such high hopes for this one, it was the one that disappointed me the most bitterly. It won't stick on top of the other shadows, so you'll see me trying to apply it with my finger on top of Euphoric and having a really, really, really hard time getting it down. Also, when I started trying to pick it up with my finger, the pan started developing hard pan very quickly. The best I could do was to dig into it with a brush and kind of disrupt the hard pan with the stiff bristles of like a small flat shader brush, and then pack it onto my lids, which is what I ended up doing to finish this look. But still, I'm sitting like 1.5 feet from my mirror here, and I can't see any glitter, any shine, any dimension. I can't see any indication on my eyes that I put that shadow on my lids. And maybe this is naked ultraviolet. Maybe this is the naked version of ultraviolet, and if I had different features or if I had a different aesthetic, maybe this is what I would be going for almost all the time, and in that case, maybe this palette would be great. If I didn't want dimension, if I didn't want richness, if I wanted to kind of build like a watercolory ghost of the eye looks that I usually do build. When I first opened it, when I started swatching it, that was the caveat that I was keeping in my mind. I was like, well, maybe this is what they were trying to do. And I've also seen people say that in reviews. I've heard people say that. I've heard people be like, well, don't expect it to be like the Menagerie Cosmetics Violet Ink or something like that because it's a naked ultraviolet palette. So I was trying to leave room for that. But every time I tried to use it on my eyes, it always went wrong. It went so wrong. I feel like today, the fourth time I tried to build an eye look, I had sort of learned my lesson enough to not to try to push it. So I just let it be kind of a watery ghost of an eye look that I would have liked to make. And so it went the best today that it's ever gone because I was like trying to work with it. But then what happened was I ended up with an eye look that I really don't like. So that's not success either. Let's actually look at the swatches. So I'll throw up on the screen the swatches that I did earlier on my arm. It's in natural light, diffuse daylight through the windows of my apartment. And you know me, you guys, I love to build up a swatch. I tried. These are not just off the cuff, one swipe finger swatches. This is me doing my best to give the shadows the benefit of the doubt and to give you a clear idea of the best that they can be. These are juicy swatches of this palette. She wants to be together. Sadie, why don't you be right here? There we go. So those are the swatches of the whole palette together. And just to give you a sense of kind of like why and how this palette disappointed me specifically, I went through my eyeshadows and I looked for other purples. I was like, what are the eyeshadows that I have that I could use to build similar looks to this palette, but that perform in the way that I generally expect of like ultraviolet or sort of rich colors like this. And there were a couple candidates, like I swatched some of these purples next to the purple from the Persona Identity 2 palette, and it just looked much richer and darker. And I know from experience that you can use the dark shadows in that palette to really build dimension into the outer corner, like they're really easy to control. I swatched some of them next to the Natasha Denona Lila palette, and you can imagine that the Natasha Denona shadows, especially the mattes, outperformed the shadows in this palette by quite a long shot. But I ended up finding among my eyeshadows the most purples and the most comparable purples in this palette of singles. These singles were sent to me pretty recently by Adept Cosmetics. They recently reformulated their single shadows, and these are some of the new ones. So I took the purples out, and I'm just gonna do a couple of swatch comparisons for you live so that you can see the difference between like what I'm used to and what I was expecting and what the ultraviolet palette actually delivered. So VR right here, which is the one that I was the most excited about because I really love rich, ruddy, duochrome shadows that have that grungy red base basically, and that is what it seems to promise. It's got like a greenish flip and a reddish base, but it turned out to be very sheer, very difficult to pick up onto my finger, very difficult to translate to my eyes. In terms of what it promises and what I thought it was going to be like, there's actually something really similar among these new Adept singles. It's ACD9. It is also a shadow that has a rich, ruddy base, pretty much exactly the same in terms of the base, and then the flip maybe has more blue and lavender in it than the green flip of VR. Look at my co-star.
Little Sadie Bean. He's so bored.
No, she's preening for the video. She loves being in the video. All right, I'm going back to it. I just got interrupted by the battery dying. Sorry, I just had to change my camera battery. But what I was about to say is that it's not the difference in the color of the reflex that makes these shadows so different from each other. Just look, this is the Urban Decay shadow, and this right here on my middle finger is the Adept shadow. So we have Urban Decay and Adept. And you might look at those swatches and say like, well, I'm kind of a low-key B. I prefer the low-key one. I prefer the wash of shimmer. But the thing is that this Adept shadow can be blended out to a wash of shimmer. Like you can blend it and buff it, and you can get something that looks kind of like the swatch of the Urban Decay shadow. But I'm telling you from experience that you can't get the Urban Decay shadow to look the way that it looks in this swatch on the palm of my hand. You can't get it to look that way on your eyelid. The formula is just not there. It just won't work that way. So if you want to get this look, the look that you're seeing on my palm from the Urban Decay shadow, if you want to get that look on your eyelid, you have to go for something creamier and more robust, like this one from Adept, and then just blend it out for a more sheer application. Okay, let's do another comparison. So Digital, which is the deepening shade that I struggled so mightily with when I was doing this eye look today. There happens to be a color from the Adept collection that's really similar. It's ACS17, and it's so much creamier. It's creamier to the touch. More of it has picked up onto my finger. It has more dimension because it's got a little more kind of creamy shimmer in it. There is supposed to be shimmer in Digital, but the shimmers in this palette pretty much swatch like mattes. So we have Urban Decay right there, and we have the Adept shadow right there. That's Urban Decay, and that one on top is the one from Adept. So here on my pointer finger, we have ACD8. It's an Adept Cosmetics shadow. And there on my middle finger is Euphoric, which is the other shade that I tried so hard to build up on my lid in the demo from today. So there's the Adept shade, and there's the Urban Decay shade. And actually, here's ACD9 from Adept, which is a shadow that looks kind of white in the pan, but when you start swatching it, it's a really, really rich, creamy duochrome white, and it has a green flip. So I'm going to swatch it next to Lucid, which is the other one that I was really excited about. It's this unusual limey shadow in this palette. And I'm trying to get a really good swatch of it. It's just so powdery. So obviously this one on top on my middle finger is Lucid from the Ultraviolet palette, and this one underneath is the one from Adept. So we have Adept and Urban Decay. I could go on, but I feel like the point has been made. And I want to reiterate that I'm not trying to specifically push Adept shadows with this. I'm not here being like, oh, these are specifically the ones that you should get instead of the Ultraviolet palette, or these are the best purples in the world. I mean, obviously these shadows are really beautiful. They're incredibly creamy. Many of them are almost putty-like. When they reformulated them, they came out kind of putty-like almost. So if you really like to dig in and really have that almost like wet cream feeling, especially with metallics, that's what they're delivering. So yeah, I do like these Adept shadows. I just decided to go with them, only them, instead of bringing all of my shadows over here and swatching a bunch of dupes or a bunch of similar colors across a bunch of different formulas. These are just a really great example of the fact that other eyeshadows perform better. So the first question is kind of answered, the question about formula. And weirdly, I feel like I integrated the answer to the second question into my discussion of the formula, the question about the color story and what it can do. I'm not a mega fan of purple eyeshadow. I do think it can be really special, and I definitely have some great purples in my arsenal, but I don't reach for purples as much as I reach for a plethora of other colors. So I was curious about this. I was like, ooh, I wonder what it's going to be like when I get my hands on this and I start doing these purple eye looks. I was kind of excited about Lucid. I felt like that bright kind of limey green white duochrome shift would maybe lend itself to some cool color stories on the eyes. Like it would really like light up the eyes and make it look more dimensional, make it look more structured. And I did try a couple of times to use Lucid. I built it up on the inner corner one time, but it was so powdery that it got into my eyes and made them water, and that look didn't stay on my eyes for long because the tears from my eyes started leaking up onto my lids, and then everything just completely fell apart because the shadows are so dusty. They didn't really have any staying power. I'm gonna try to put it on right now so you guys can see, in case anyone out there is really interested in Lucid. I'm gonna build up a bunch of it on my finger. Actually, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna do Lucid on one eye, and I'm gonna do the Adept equivalent on the other eye. Yeah, it's just so dusty that it's doing three things that are really difficult. One, it's hard to build it up. Two, it's taking up a lot of surface area. Like it's not staying in its spot. I'm putting it down and it's dusting itself over the entire lid. And three, it's patchy. It's getting patchy. I'm gonna put ACD9 on my other lid. Oh yeah, now we're cooking with gas. Now we're cooking with gas, Sadie. So this is a stickier shadow, and it's really much richer, and it's also much brighter in terms of the reflect. So because of the texture, it's doing exactly what I want it to do, and then it's giving me a much more dramatic, a much brighter effect. I guess the point of going through this with Lucid is to say that this is the one prop, this is the bit of props that I'll give to the color story. I do like this like grungy purple based, but also nudie, neutral, purpley wash of color situation with a slightly gray deepening shade and then an accent shade of this color shifting lime. I like the idea of the color story. If the shadows performed, I do think that there would be something to be said for it. And I think that the people who innovated the color story, who were like, this is what we're going to put forward, these are the color ideas and the thoughts about structure and the thoughts about color and texture that we're going to put out there into the makeup world with the release of this palette. I do think that those people really did hit on something. I think it's kind of cool. This is cool. This purple look with this really bright limey duochrome on the inner part of the lid. It's cool. It's just that you can't get this look with this actual palette. As I was getting to know this palette, I was kind of trying to paint a picture for myself of the demographic of people for whom this might be the right palette. And the closest that I can come in terms of painting that picture for you is to say that if there's a demographic of people who want to play with color, but they really don't want it to be very exciting. Like if they want to play with color and they want purple to be the color that they're playing with, but they just don't want much more than like a dusty wash of any given color on their lids ever at all. I guess you could say that if they made the palette that they were trying to make, if this is exactly what they were trying to do when they made this palette, then that's the demographic of people for whom they were making the palette. But if one of those people came to me and was like, this is what I want out of eyeshadow and I want it to be purple, what should I buy? I would send them to ColourPop. I would be like, buy one of the ColourPop, buy the Please Like Me palette or whatever the ColourPop purple one is. And then I think they recently came out with like a pastel purple tie-dye palette. I still wouldn't recommend this palette to those very people. And there might be something that I'm missing. I would love to know what you guys think. I feel like I'm done here. I feel like I've said my piece, and I feel like this might be the most scathing review I've ever given. Is it? Or was that to the Becca liquid highlighter? Let me know what you think. Is Sadie not a bean? Is she not the beanest bean you've ever seen? Sadie really likes to put her paw and her little chin on our hands, like when we're snuggling with her. When we put our little hand, she really likes to rest her little cheek on my hand or on Joe's hand. It's one of the cutest things about her. All right, enough of this. It's time to go. Thank you for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. And I hope that you are remembering to take extra good care of yourself right now so that you can be the most effective version of yourself as you do your work in the world.